Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to this webinar to discuss the new field of membership rule. My name is Matthew Baloris. I'm the Deputy Director of NCOA's Office of Consumer Financial Protection and Access. I'm also the moderator for today's webinar on the amendments to the Charting and Field of Membership Manual. We hope to provide helpful information about this important topic during our conversation today. Just a couple of administrative items before we get into the substance of the webinar. First, please make sure the volume on your computer is turned up so you can hear the webcast. If you're having trouble viewing a slide, click on the Enlarge Slides button on the bottom of the console. And please do allow pop-ups from this website. A screen resolution of 1024 by 768 or higher will allow you to see the slides appropriately. You can submit questions at any time during the webcast in the Ask a Question box on the left-hand area of the console window. We have set aside time at the end of our discussion to address questions. And if your question isn't answered during the webcast, please be aware it wasn't for naught. We are currently developing guidance to be issued in the very near future to coincide with this rule. So questions that we get throughout the webinar and questions that we aren't able to answer, but we will get an inventory of all the questions. We can certainly make every attempt to incorporate those into the guidance we will be issuing. I imagine we'll use the majority of our time today to address questions related to this rule, but we do have a very good cross-section of staff here with a field of membership background. So if you have questions on general field of membership matters or anything processing-wise, feel free to submit those also. This webcast will be archived for on-demand viewing in approximately 2 weeks after this live event, and we'll issue a press release to let the industry know when it is available. Before we get started, I am pleased to have both NCOA board members with us to make some introductory comments. First, I'll turn things over to Chairman McWaters.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you to you and your staff for hosting this. It's a tremendous amount of work. I wish to also thank those in the credit union community that are listening in. It's a very valuable process here. I'll be brief, and I want to mention 2 points. One, with the new administration, there has been a regulatory freeze place. And so some of you may be thinking, hey, does this FOM rule, which is scheduled to go live today, I guess? Monday. Will it be stayed? Will it be stopped? Will it be in abeyance for a while? And the answer is no. There's some technical reasons as to why it's no, but I think the most plain-spoken reason is that we're talking about regulatory relief here. We're not talking about regulatory burden. From my reading of the previous memorandum, the goal is to stop excessive regulatory burden. This is regulatory relief. So we're going forward with this. Mr. Metzger and I are in total agreement on that. The second point I wish to mention is the ABA banker lawsuit. This rule is under litigation now, and I just simply wish to say that, and again, I think I can speak for Mr. Metzger, and he can correct me if I'm mistaken, but we were particularly vigilant in reviewing this rule, working with NCOA staff to make sure it complied in full and toto with the Federal Credit Union Act and also with the Administrative Procedure Act. So the litigation will continue, and I'm hoping it will end much like the litigation just ended with respect to the member business lending rule. And lastly, I'll close by just thanking members of the community for commenting on the second FOM rule, the one that was proposed and the one that's under consideration now. We very much need your comments. We welcome them, and thank you very much. Enjoy the seminar.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm thrilled that in less than a week, federal credit unions will have a number of exciting new opportunities to serve their communities and select employee groups. The field of membership reforms in this rule, which takes effect on Monday, are the most dramatic changes since the passage of the Credit Union Membership Act of 1998. Field of membership modernization was one of my top priorities when I joined the board over 3 years ago, and I'm delighted that the board unanimously approved these changes, which will help both community charters and seg charters meet the financial needs of American families, particularly those of modest means. It's important to note these changes were implemented to fulfill the agency's statutory mandate to create a national system of cooperative credit for provident and productive purposes. It is American consumers who are the primary beneficiaries of this rule. They'll have increased access to affordable financial services through their local credit union. I know there's a lot to cover in this webinar, so that will conclude my comments and turn it back over to Matt and his team. And just the comment, I know you've been working over a year in many facets of putting this whole thing together. And I know Chairman McWaters and I really, really appreciate the great efforts that you have put into it.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So joining me today for this discussion also is members of our staff of the Office of Consumer Financial Protection and Access, as well as one of our staff attorneys from the Office of General Counsel. So I have Robert Leonard and Rita Woods, who are the division directors of our 2 consumer access divisions. We have Marvin Shaw, who's a staff attorney with our Office of General Counsel. And we also have Rick Mumm and Annette Moore, who are our program officers here in our Division of Consumer Access. So like I said, we have a good complement of skill sets here, and we're welcome to entertain any questions you have. As you can see on the slide, before we move on, there's a disclaimer at the bottom. Just wanted to point out the information presented is provided for informational purposes only to enhance understanding of the recent changes to our charting and field of membership process. This presentation expresses the views and opinions of staff of NCUA and is not binding on NCUA or NCUA board members. And with that, we'll go ahead and move on. We're going to focus on general understanding of FOM requirements as we had made these final changes. And so we're going to break this down in a manner that we're going to cover each of the main sections of the rule. And we set it up in a way that as we discuss each section, we're going to stop and we're going to talk about how credit unions apply for that particular remedy, and then we'll also talk about how we'll process that request. And hopefully that'll stimulate some good conversation, some good questions. And again, I'm really interested to see what kind of questions we get that would help put the final touches on the guidance we'll be issuing to coincide with this rule. So we'll get right into it to talk about the core area requirement that was repealed with this final rule. And just a little bit of reference, we're talking about a core-based statistical area. You'll hear that mentioned a lot. We'll likely refer to it just as CBSA. That's the collective term used for both metropolitan statistical areas and micropolitan statistical areas that credit unions can make bids to pursue. So basically, this final rule element eliminated the requirement that a credit union be required to serve the core area when they want to expand or convert to a community charter. We found in our research that we were denying or deferring requests, or people weren't willing to move forward on requests because they had to take on an area that was much larger a scale than they wanted to. They wanted to be able to grow at a much more slower pace to be able to do that with efficiencies. So this remedy allows them to do that. And so with that, we'll move on, and we have an example here I'll give you. So here's the principal city in the 6-county Lexington-Fayette, Kentucky metropolitan statistical area is Lexington-Fayette. The most populated county is in the MSA is Fayette. So if a credit union made a bid to serve that MSA, they would have to make sure that they took the county of Fayette. This new rule permits them to now serve any portion within that they want to, subject, of course, to a population limit of 2.5 million. So Rita, could you give us a little bit of background of how credit unions can apply to get this, pursue this, or what is needed to actually make a request regarding this, given that we've taken this out?
Sure, Matt. But before I get to what credit unions need to submit, I just wanted to say that certainly us folks in the Division of Consumer Access are happy for this change. And as you noted, we've had to deny applications in the past because the area that the credit union was requesting did not or they had to include the core, or if you will, the principal city of that geographical area before we could approve that area. So certainly we're happy for this change. With regard to the application process and what credit unions have to submit, there is no change, actually. Credit unions will still submit their business and marketing plan as before for any community conversion or expansion. Simply, the credit union will then just have to indicate in that in their application or package, if you will, that they intend to serve this core-based statistical area. And then, of course, as I said, they will outline in their business and marketing plan their intent or ability to serve the core-based statistical area.
Okay. Thank you much. And Rob, once we get a request that a credit union wants to serve an area, how do we process based on this?
Well, Matt, I don't see any real major change in how we will review the application. We'll continue to be interested in looking at the rationale for the area they've chosen for pursuing the expansion or the conversion. But what we're looking forward to is the new rule is going to give them credit union officials much more flexibility in selecting an area that best meets their needs. So we'll continue as in the past to look at how the expansion or the conversion will improve member service, help them with their strategic goals, or help adherence to their business plan or safety and soundness issues. But at the same time, it will give a greater pool of areas available for credit union officials to choose from. So certainly that will help in terms of credit unions best deploy their resources in a way that's consistent with what the needs are in the area.
Okay. And we've already touched on a little bit of discussing a template and how they apply for it through the business and marketing plan review. And so I should highlight there's an existing guidance we have out there, Letter to Federal Credit Unions number 11 FCU-03, which is still relevant. One of the things we're looking at in finalizing this guidance is whether we will reissue an entire new guidance that will incorporate all this stuff. But I think as we go through this, you'll see there isn't a lot of substantive changes to how we process. There's a few things that we will cover that are more substantive. So we may do like we've done in the past with some of the CFPB rules where there's a change to a mortgage-related rule. We've already issued guidance in the past. We may just issue supplemental guidance for this and then if you go back to that letter to credit unions I mentioned, letter to federal credit unions, we'll have a watermark at the beginning of that that'll show that there was some supplemental guidance that was issued in 2017 and refer readers of that to that. But we'll finalize that and get that out as quickly as we can. All right, let's move on to the next item. There was a much-needed technical remedy to prevent unintended consequences or unintended disqualification of a portion of a core-based statistical area that falls within a population cap solely because the core-based statistical area as a whole exceeds it. So the new rule allows us now to look at a request a credit union makes to serve an area and not inappropriately disqualify it because they want to serve a MSA that exceeds the population cap of 2.5 million. And Rita, can you cover a little bit of how they'll go ahead and make this request?
Sure. Credit unions will certainly just make their request as they've always done in the past. There's no real change with regard to what they would submit to for this population limit. And again, as Matt has mentioned before, the letter to credit unions, 11 FCU-03, which includes the template for the business and marketing plan. Credit unions will use that as their guide to develop their business and marketing plans. And we also hope to include a list of the approved communities on our website at ncua.gov under the Services, Charter, and Field of Membership section on our landing page. So hopefully you'll see in the future, or near future, if you will, a list of the approved communities.
On our website.
On our website.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you, Rita. So just to recap that, they'll essentially define the geographic area they want to serve. As they do now, they'll provide a map so we can see an illustration of what that is, and then we can look at what the population of that is to see if it fits within the 2.5 million limit. Thank you. And then, Rob, how about how we'll process it once we get the request?
Well, here again, it's will not really change too much how we process it internally. It's just that this change is going to give credit unions many more options, though, because it's going to open up, instead of restricting it to just portions of statistical areas or core-based statistical areas, or as we'll talk later, combined statistical areas, instead of restricting it to just those where the areas in their entirety have populations of 2.5 million, it'll give the flexibility that it's the area, the credit union itself that it wishes to serve. So again, we look forward to working with credit unions to implement that flexibility, but it's not going to really change too much what we would do internally.
Okay, thank you. And I would encourage those. I know that in my short time in the Office of Consumer Financial Protection and Access, I have seen some that we've denied based on this. So those of you who have been denied this one in the past, this is a remedy that you can start looking at the strategic options for this one, certainly.
Yes. And then just to give a quick example of how this plays out in practice, if we could kindly go to the next slide. Mm-hmm. Okay. So just to give an example of how this would apply in practice, under the current rule, which is in effect for only a few more days now, the Atlanta metropolitan statistical area that includes Sandy Springs and Roswell, Georgia, has a population right now of 5.7 million. So under the current rule, credit unions couldn't consider basing a core-based statistical area on more than one county in this area because the area itself is over 2.5 million in population. But now under the new rule, it wouldn't be limited by the population of the entire area. It would just be the portion they wish to serve can't exceed the 2.5 million. So we realized that was an unintended consequence of the changes we made back in 2010, and so we are hearing everybody's voice, and the new rule does address that. So we just wanted to show an example of how that would play out in actual practice.
Thank you, Rob. The new rule also added a third presumptive community in addition to a single political jurisdiction or a core-based statistical area, and that being a combined statistical area, which is designated by the Office of Management and Budget. It's still subject to a population cap of 2.5 million for the area. And we wanted to show you a live link here, but our testing of this has not been working very well. So this listing of combined statistical areas will be available on our website, and we'll show you where this link is available for you to get access to it, but it does contain all the listings of these. My last recollection of this, there were roughly 174 combined statistical areas. Even at that, with a population limit of 2.5 million, there were some 152 that would qualify in whole under that 2.5 million cap. And again, I would point out, for those 22 that are over the 2.5 million, the rule allows you to serve a portion of that combined statistical area subject to the population cap. So even where the combined statistical area exceeds that, you can still carve out a service area subject to that population cap that you'd like to serve. Just some examples I would refer you to of combined statistical areas. I wanted to show you this live, but we did have time to put a slide in here. This is the Atlanta, Athens, Clark County, Sandy Springs, Georgia combined statistical area, and you'll see it has 8 some odd combinations of metropolitan statistical areas and micropolitan statistical areas. So again, a federal credit union could make a bid to serve a portion of that subject to the population limit. Just by way of reference, there's also other ones I would just point to. We don't have on the slide, but Elmira, Corning, New York has the Corning, New York micropolitan statistical area, the Elmira, New York metropolitan. I also would point you to the Kokomo, Peru, Indiana combined statistical area, which is made up of the Kokomo metropolitan statistical area and the Peru micropolitan statistical area. So again, those are available. They will be available on our website. And now with this rule, credit unions have the ability to serve a combined statistical area. And so, Rita, can you hit a little bit about what credit union needs to do to make a request for this?
Sure, Matt. For credit unions requesting to serve a combined statistical area, there is no change in the application process. However, a credit union will need to indicate in its application its desire to serve this combined statistical area. We would hope that the credit union will also include a map that kind of outlines the combined statistical area geographical boundaries. And of course, as I've indicated before, on all other community conversions or expansions, we would look to receive a business and marketing plan for the request to serve this combined statistical area.
Thank you. And Rob, once we get it, how about how we process it?
Well, I hate to sound like that proverbial broken record, but in this case, it really won't have a significant change in what we do in terms of the office of reviewing. Of course, it'll provide more options for the credit unions. And of course, any area that they pick, they're going to have to demonstrate the ability and intent to serve the area. We still have a responsibility to make sure an expansion or a conversion doesn't result in safety and soundness concerns, and it's consistent with the credit union's administrative capacity. But we really won't change too much what we're looking for. It's just the area, we're pleased that the rule is going to give more options, but then the option chosen has to make sense too from a business perspective.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Let's move on now to another element in the rule. Federal credit unions will now be able to add an outside area contiguous to a core-based statistical area, a combined statistical area, or a single political jurisdiction. This gives credit unions flexibility to add those areas immediately adjacent to these single political jurisdictions or statistical area communities. I also want to point out that this option is also available for a credit union that wishes to convert to a community charter and make a compelling case that there is sufficient interaction with the groups, with the people outside of a recognized core-based statistical area and what they want to serve. So an example of this, I think, to highlight the core-based statistical area of Asheville, North Carolina, which I believe this is out in the very western part of the state of North Carolina, contains 4 counties for a population of approximately 425,000. Those counties listed there, Buncombe, Haywood, Henderson, and Madison. Under the new rule, a federal credit union would be permitted to apply to add an adjacent area to these 4 counties, such as Polk County, which is not in that MSA, and it has a population of 20,500. So this would still be subject to a population limit, but there are cases we have seen, and there is compelling evidence to show that while a combined statistical area, a core-based statistical area is something that a credit union can serve, certainly has a level of interaction to make it a presumptive community, there are nonetheless incidences where there are people outside of a presumptive community who lack financial services or want access to, and credit unions are turning them away when they come in to want to join the credit union. So I think all the elements in total of this rule will certainly provide a lot of options, and this is one where this may just be needed in those cases where there isn't something that a credit union can make themselves available to under the core-based statistical area options that are presumptive communities. And Rita, I'll turn to you to ask about how a credit union can make a request for this.
Sure, Matt, but just before we get into how a credit union will submit its request, just want to kind of reiterate just a few caveats regarding the adjacent area additions. As you stated, this final rule reinstates the narrative method of a well-defined local community option for a singular purpose, the addition of adjacent area outside an existing or proposed community. The community does have to, or will be subject to the 2.5 million population limit. And then the credit union still must show or its ability to and intent to serve the community. And the way they would do that, of course, is through providing the business and marketing plan. So with regard to what the credit union needs to submit in terms of its request, the credit union will have to submit a written narrative to demonstrate interaction or common interest among residents in the proposed community as a whole, meaning we will look at the community that they're desiring to serve in that adjacent area, again, as a whole to determine, whether or not the credit union has the ability and intent to serve that area.
Okay. And in the final rule, we did include some factors for consideration in trying to make this written narrative to show that interaction. Our guidance we're going to be issuing will further flesh some of this out. Just to hit on a few of those, we'll consider items such as an economic hub in the area that draws people together, isolation of areas that may be isolated due to a geographic region or something, quasi-governmental agencies that may be serving the collective community that the credit union wishes to serve. And particularly, I like the shared public facilities. If the area that's inside a well-defined local community that a credit union's been serving, there's a facility that also serves people outside of that community and they have that commonality, that's something we can look into in fleshing out that narrative also. So, Rob, I'm going to turn to you now to ask about, tell us a little bit about the process for when we get these requests.
Well, finally, something will change. So, seriously, this does give additional flexibility. And, Matt, you had highlighted on some of the areas, but basically what would change in our process is it wouldn't be a totally objective standard anymore. It would reintroduce the concept of being able to submit information where areas don't fit into quite the objective category, where there's an outlying area where that would have a relationship with a core-based statistical area or a single political district as appropriate. And then so we would evaluate these specific factors. What I would envision a lot is what would be very, I think, a good use of anybody's resources is if a credit union has an interest in serving an adjacent area to an existing community, or if they're applying for a new community where it would go just beyond a core-based statistical area and these options we've talked about before, I would recommend contacting our office at the fairly early stages so we could help direct your research and help you get a better understanding of the type of information we're looking for so we can see if the area is a community where they interact or have common interests. Because one thing we, in the past, before we had objective criteria, basically from 1999 through the early part of 2010, we did allow a narrative approach, and sometimes there was a misunderstanding as to what was needed, and credit unions were spending a lot of resources, and perhaps we were spending our resources as well on areas that were not helpful in showing whether or not an area was a community. It's what I always like to tell people in the past: if you're doing a narrative, the best thing to do is, it's kind of like you're writing a term paper. The best thing to do is not focus on the volume, but cover the topic. So in the rule itself, we give some specific guidance about what would support interaction or common interests, such as an economic hub or a population center, if it wasn't already readily apparent by the core-based statistical area. And then Matt touched upon isolated areas and quasi-governmental agencies or other designations showing the interdependence among the residents of the areas, or colleges and universities. Sometimes even local colleges will do a study showing the importance outlying areas have on a larger core area on that. So these are the types of things that will change in terms of that. And what we would strongly recommend working with our team to at least just help guide the research to help you determine whether or not an area would qualify. And then if we could go to the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, if you go back one, please. Oh, looks like we were missing one. It's okay.
The previous slide, Franz, even before this. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry. Well, it's okay. I just wanted to give the example. What would apply? For example, let's say a credit union was in, just picking a metropolitan area at random, Asheville, North Carolina. The Asheville, North Carolina metropolitan area is a 4-county area with 425,000 residents. If a credit union was interested in serving either the whole metropolitan area or a couple of counties within them, but then they could also apply to add an additional county outside of those 4 counties, again, if it meets the requirements for showing that those residents in that outlying area, so it'd have to be contiguous. If that residents in that contiguous area interact collectively with the larger core-based statistical area, then that could open up another option for expansion. But again, what we recommend is, before spending too much in terms of time and resources, please, I would recommend consulting with our office so we can help give you some advice about where to direct your research. So with that said, one other thing I'd like to touch on, just because as we're kind of had a lot of conversations about different options for local communities, thought I'd address one question now. Well, it's all fresh in our mind. And the question, one question we have is, can more than one credit union serve the same community? And yes, that, as in the past, that remains true. Any credit union can apply to serve a local community that was previously approved by NCUA. So that would be a category of approval that anything we've approved basically since 1999, or and certainly there's no overlap protection for community credit unions. It as long as the business and marketing plan supports it, certainly more than one credit union can serve. And then are all of the community options available to any other charter type? Somebody had asked whether it would be an existing community, a multiple common bond, or a single common bond. And again, the answer is yes on that. They're all available for all of those types. So with that, I'll turn it back to Matt.
Thanks. And then the one thing I want to point out, too, before we leave this one topic, because we have had a lot of questions about this, in looking at a credit union's ability to add an adjacent area, from a processing standpoint, we will be able to place a strong reliance on the history that credit union has in serving a community and serving the existing community. And as example, the one that's still on the screen, this credit union likely could just show in the rule that we had provided a streamlined business and marketing plan for such cases. So if a credit union has been serving the Asheville, North Carolina metropolitan statistical area for some time and wanted to add a small portion or even all of Polk County, which is right near it and touches it, I would envision we would be able to rely heavily on the history the credit union has in serving the existing community that they had in making a bid for the expansion. So that's something I wanted to touch on here too. So now we're going to go under rural districts and talk about some of those elements. First one I'll hit on is the new rule allows a rural district with a population of up to 1 million people. Now, to simplify the application process and moving to 1 million people, we eliminated the ability to use a limit of 3% of the population of the state in which a majority of the rural district residents are located. That's the existing policy we have now. With increasing the limit to 1 million persons, the alternative became virtually unnecessary and superfluous with the new rule because the million population limit would apply to virtually all the states. So that will streamline the process a little bit for credit unions. We think that's a good thing. Rural districts will continue to have to meet qualifying requirements. Specifically, a rural district must have either a population density of 100 people per square mile or less, or have a majority of its population in areas the Census Bureau designated as rural. In addition, with this final rule, we also added another element in helping to meet that criteria. We recognize areas as rural where the majority of residents live in locales the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau also designates as rural, and they maintain a list of those also. So Rita, tell us a little bit about how a credit union can make a request under the higher population limit for a rural district.
Sure. Well, the credit union can make their request as the same as before. No real change in this regard. The credit union will still have to submit its business and marketing plan to support the ability and intent to serve the larger population. However, what I do want to mention here is that when the credit union submits their application to serve this larger area with regard to the population limit, they will need to include the most recent population information based on the U.S. Census data information. So we would be looking to see the most recent population estimates that are published by the U.S. Census Bureau.
Okay. And Rob, how about processing the request?
Well, again, I guess we go back to that broken record again. Not too much will change on that. It will just, again, open up additional options for credit union officials. Again, but of course, it has to make sense from a business perspective with the business and marketing plan. And the credit union would have to have the ability, intent, and the appropriate resources to be able to serve the area well in its entirety. That we would look at factors, continue to look at factors such as how it would improve member service, how it would benefit the area, whether it's consistent with what the credit union is trying to accomplish strategically. And so we do look forward to the additional options it will enter, or it will make available to credit unions. And, so we're looking forward to that.
Okay. And I would point out, too, here, with a million person population limit, that was meant to give federal credit unions a long-term strategy in serving an area that's needing financial services. It may be that some credit unions find that they need to grow incrementally into a larger rural district, increase the size incrementally and see how they work with that, how their business and marketing plan fits with that before they achieve something up to that amount. So I just wanted to highlight that point, too. So similar, or along the same lines of the rural district, under our current rules, we allow a rural district to extend over state lines. But in order to provide a proper balance to give a credit union sufficient scale to support operations of a larger rural district, but not to be so overly large in a geographic scale, we continue to permit a rural district to cross state boundaries, but we limit any multi-state expansion to only those states immediately bordering the credit union's headquarters or main office. And our next slide has a map that will try to illustrate some of this. So if you look at in this example, a credit union could have a rural district that contained a portion of Montana and Wyoming. They could also have one that contained a portion of North Dakota or South Dakota. When you apply the multi-state limit, I would point you to a credit union headquartered in North Dakota could theoretically serve a rural district encompassing contiguous portions of Montana, South Dakota, or Minnesota. However, it could not serve any portion of Wyoming, Nebraska, or Iowa. These states are not immediately contiguous to North Dakota. Said another way, they don't touch the headquartered state, so they wouldn't be able to go through those states to serve those I just mentioned. And Rita, tell us a little about how they make a request for this.
Sure. For rural district or multi-state expansion, there's really no change in this regard. As you know, we've said before, the credit union still will have to submit its business and marketing plan, and of course, we want to see a map of the requested area they're wanting to serve. But there's no significant changes, if you will, to the application process.
Okay, thank you. And Rob, how about our process?
Well, again, it won't change too much internally of what we do. We would continue to look at how the proposal is consistent with what the credit union is trying to accomplish, and how they're meeting the needs of the area, and how the conversion or the expansion would improve member service or address safety and soundness issues. But just in kind of a related matter, we were talking a little bit about there's a specific state rules with the rural district and that it cannot go beyond one state adjacent to where the state's headquarters are. A related question came in when we were talking before about adding adjacent areas, and the question came in is, can an adjacent area cross the state line? And in that case, yes, they can cross state lines, as long as they can demonstrate that the residents in the other state interact or sufficiently share common interests with the core-based statistical area in the neighboring state, that would be available. So I just wanted to kind of touch upon that. And then one other general question that came in about communities, and of course there'll be ample opportunity for more questions at the end of the session, but one question asked again about the adjacent area. If the population is already, if there's an existing community with a population already over the 2.5 million, would the credit union have flexibility to add one adjacent area? And unfortunately in this case, no, that wouldn't be possible under the current rule or under the soon-to-be current rule, because it would go over the limit is very specific at 2.5 million for this rule.
Okay. And just to clarify for me, when you first started reading that, are you referring to a sort of a grandfather community, one that was established prior to the population cap being in place?
Well, no, if there was a grandfathered one, then that would be eligible on that. That would, because that's one type of community that's always going to be permissible, is if the NCUA has determined in the past that it was a local community, then that would still qualify.
Okay.
On that, so I just wanted to, that's always going to remain an option.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, so we're going to move into a discussion on underserved areas, and I'm going to focus on the first section of it, which is dealing with our concentration of facilities ratio. And when we calculate whether a proposed underserved area meets our existing concentration of facilities test, we identify and compare the number of institutions within the underserved or distressed area to the number of institutions in non-distressed areas within the underserved area. If this analysis happens to show a higher ratio of institutions exist for non-distressed areas within the underserved area to that within it as a whole, the area is concluded to be underserved. I should point out, too, with this, if there are no non-distressed areas within the underserved area, the test will be performed on a non-distressed area adjacent or touching the boundaries of the underserved area. The Act requires that we rely on data from NCUA and from the other federal banking agencies to determine if an area is underserved by other depository institutions. In doing this, a strict interpretation of this language would give us flexibility to exclude non-depository institutions or even non-community credit unions who, by definition, are not able to serve that area unless it's a multiple common bond with permission to serve that area. So this can create a distortion in the concentration of facilities test ratio, and unlikely circumstances it could lead to a negative outcome of that. So in looking at that, we decided to give some relief to this, and we're going to process these. Before I get into Rob's discussion on there, Rita, let me ask you, I'm sorry, Rob, can you tell us a little bit about how a credit can make a request for this?
Sure. What we would like to see creditors do is work with us again in terms of doing the computation. We have some resources that we've developed in-house to compute the relative availability of service of depository institutions in an underserved area when compared to non-distressed portions of it. So basically, in essence, there's three requirements for an underserved area for a credit union to be able, a multiple common bond credit union to add an underserved area. It has to meet the requirements for being a local community and have economic distress and meeting the CDFI arm of the Treasury's definition of economic distress. Most often that's based on factors such as unemployment, or median family income would probably be the most common. They would have to meet the distress. They would have to have significant unmet needs for loans or equity investments. And then the third part is they would have to be underserved by other financial institutions. So what we would do is we have resources in-house that use the FDIC's data and NCUA's data that identifies the locations of branches in an area. And we thus far have based our computations on that information. And then we would compare the relative availability of service in an underserved part of an area with the non-distressed. And if there are fewer institutions available to the distressed part of the area, then that would meet our regulatory definition of being underserved. So we would continue to provide assistance in that regard. And then if the initial review showed that the area did not qualify as being underserved, we are also open to revisiting to look at the ratio and the computation, or and to see if there might be including any information about either a credit union that can't serve an area as a community, or an FDIC-insured institution that is not a depository institution. And if we can isolate those from the computation, since they truly aren't providing depository services to the community, then we would revisit that to see if that would be another way to see if the area is in fact underserved and eligible to receive service from a multiple common bond charter. So we don't anticipate any changes of what the credit unions themselves have to do, but we do have some additional options to look at it if there are special circumstances in an area that has a lot of non-depositories. So that's what I would see, how they would be able to make the request.
Thank you, Rob. And I was remiss in transitioning from the previous discussion on rural districts, which sort of closed out our discussion on community options. We were moving into discussions available for multiple common bond credit unions. I should have clarified that an underserved area is an option that's only available to a multiple common bond credit union. Rita, I think Rob hit on a lot of the processing stuff. You want to add anything to it?
The only thing I would just add to what Rob indicated in terms of, us providing assistance to credit unions that need assistance in terms of determining whether an area is underserved by the other depository institutions. I would add that we could also assist in this process ahead of time, that we could assist the credit union in determining whether or not the underserved area is underserved by other depository institutions before they actually complete their application. So we could do this. They can submit a request to us early on in the process and have us determine whether or not that area is underserved by other depository institutions.
Okay, thank you. Another option for underserved areas, because the Act gives NCUA flexibility in making a determination that an area is underserved by other institutions, we can rely on data, either we have ourselves or from the federal banking agencies. We also have some options in here for alternatives to the concentration of facilities test. There are some that find it very challenging to work and go through, which is why both Rob and Rita have been quick to say that we offer some help in going through that process. But under the new rule, I'm sorry, Franz, move ahead. Under the new rule, we will allow a credit union to use underserved counties designated by the CFPB on their websites for a lot of the rulemaking that they do. We'll also allow alternatives as long as those alternatives are based on information available from the federal banking agencies. So if a credit union has access to information, whether it's HMDA data or other stuff that they want to show that an area is underserved, we welcome a discussion to see if that would be something we can use to support an issue underserved. If either the concentration of facilities test is too arduous or it presents an outcome that doesn't get us where we need to be to show that that is underserved. And Rob, if you could walk us through a request such as that.
Oh, sure. This gives just additional options for if the ratios don't show that an area is underserved, but there's special circumstances. We'd have the availability of research the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has already done where they've designated counties as underserved. If they've already done that research and used some fairly rigid criteria in making that determination, we've made a determination we can accept that information to show that the area is underserved. Or the other way to qualify too, if the ratio analysis does not work, or if the CFPB has not designated a county as underserved. There might be other documentation that has been published by other banking regulators or credit union regulators that would show an area is underserved if there's other evidence. One example of that we had that I thought was fairly promising is credit union itself shared some research they had done using HMDA data, or Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, where they could use that. And I thought that was kind of a promising approach, where they were able to use information about lending patterns showing that the area was underserved. So what the new rule does is it opens up these possibilities and gives us more options to consider, especially taking into account that sometimes just the pure ratios don't always capture the characteristics of an area. So,
thank you, Rob. Rita, anything to add?
I would just add to that is that, of course, the credit union would submit with this request the CFPB, if they're choosing to use the CFPB data in terms of whether or not the area or the county is underserved, then they would submit that, of course, with their request. We would take a look at that and validate that information. If the credit union is choosing to use an alternative method, then, of course, we will take a look at the information or the data that they have as well as their analysis in determining that this information meets the other depository institutions' requirements. And we would, again, validate that information to make sure that it meets the requirements. Of course, we also is planning to list on our website the list of the CFPB underserved counties on our website so that that's made readily available for credit unions to see what counties are underserved based on CFPB's information.
Great, thank you. The other thing I think would be good to point out here is as we move forward in implementing this rule, and Rob touched on a couple of creative ideas credit unions had to try and show that an area is underserved. When we get some of those ideas and we are able to positively conclude that an area is underserved using an alternative method, as long as it's made available from the data from us or the federal banking agencies, we can post those theories or that analysis, not the individual stuff, but at least the process that was gone through, to allow other credit unions to take advantage of that opportunity if they want to. So we hope to be building a database, if you will, of options that are available to meet that conclusion that an area is underserved by other institutions. So look for stuff to come out on that as we go through this.
Oh, well, one question that came up is, does this rule apply at all to a state credit union? In this case, no, it would not, because we would only have oversight from a field of membership standpoint under for federal charters. So only federal multiple common bond credit unions can add underserved areas. However, there are some states that have what are known as parity provisions. So I guess indirectly it could apply in that example. But in that case, you should speak with your state regulator, because that would be their area of authority. That they would be totally responsible for the field of membership of a state chartered credit union.
Thank you, Rob.
Sure.
We're going to continue moving on to discussing options available for multiple common bond credit unions. The next one up here is the inclusion of persons working under contract for entities possessing a strong dependency relationship with the occupational group. First thing I should clarify and point out is persons regularly working. There's got to be a regular basis to show that common bond of occupation. So that's the first hurdle. It's got to be regularly working for. This option is to recognize the evolution of the business model to rely on a third party to provide employment services. And quite honestly, it just adds parity to a single common bond that can have this option available to it. Rob, can you talk us a little bit about how a credit union can request this?
Sure. Again, this applies to the multiple common bond credit unions, because single can always request to add this type of in their charter. But for multiple common bond credit unions, the way we plan to handle this going forward is for groups that were added before the rule goes into effect, which is next Monday, credit unions could request a housekeeping amendment to request, basically what this one amendment would be, it would be one clause in the charter that indicates persons who work for entities regularly under contract for any occupational group listed in the charter, subject to whatever geographic or other types of restrictions might have been in place based on the preceding clauses. So for those groups, credit unions could request this housekeeping amendment, and that would address all of the groups added up until this point in time. And then going forward, if a credit union wished to add an occupational group that would include contractors, the group sponsor letter should include a requesting service should also indicate that they wanted to include the contractors and include them in the total count of potential members. So in this case, these two would you would not be able to submit these requests through FOMIA, which is the Field of Membership Internet Application System, but you could submit it through either regular mail, email, or fax. And we would process the housekeeping amendments could be processed fairly readily. And then the request going forward, it may take a little bit more information for us to review based on the fact that we would have to look at how that affects the ability of the credit union the ability rather of the group to form its own credit union in view of the additional potential members. Now, it's important to note too that credit unions going forward are responsible for ensuring that people added under these provisions or these new clauses that they have met the definition of a strong dependency relationship. So the credit union itself would be responsible for making that determination, and then there's some guidance in the rule and the preamble to this new rule explaining that, but it's basically showing the economic dependence that the contractors have on the group as a whole. So we just wanted to kind of make that point. But we would look for credit unions to acknowledge that the recognition of that responsibility, both going forward and for having that housekeeping amendment for the prior groups. So anyway.
Thank you, Rob. Rita, maybe just walk through a little bit of what some of these wordings would look like from a processing standpoint.
Sure. An example of the housekeeping wording would consist of persons who regularly work for entities on the contract and possessing a strong dependency relationship with any occupational group added to this charter before February 6, 2017, subject to any limitations in the clause describing the group. So just to clarify this wording, this would only be available to employees working under the same description that's already included within their charter. For example, if the entity has employees that are under contract working for the group that's listed in the charter, then they would only be able to serve that entity or those employees that are located within that same geographical area that's included in the actual charter, although the entity may have a nationwide company, if you will, but they would only be able to include the employees that are located within the same geographical area where the charter, the contract employees that are located within the same geographical area where the group is listed in their charter.
Thanks. And Rob, if I could just jump back to you, because I want to make sure we hit on the distinction between the housekeeping and going forward. Tell us a little bit about the rationale for the housekeeping amendment availability for groups added before the effective date of the rule.
Sure. Well, essentially, for all of those groups that we added before the rule becomes effective, we've already made the determination the group can't form its own credit union. So that's a part of it. And also, our goal is to minimize the regulatory burden associated with taking advantage of this new opportunity. So those are the primary, and then also the administrative burden internally on that for processing that. We want to make it as easy as possible to implement it, and I think we're on a sound basis for that because we have already determined they can't form their own credit union.
Great. So, thank you.
Sure.
And Rita, going back to
just to provide an example for groups for new groups that are added to include the contractors. The wording for a new group would consist of employees, and again, this is the new wording, or persons who work regularly for entities under contract possessing a strong dependency relationship with, of course, the group who work in or paid from whatever city or state the group is located.
Thank you. Still moving on to multiple common bond options. We have an option for employees of office or industrial park tenants. The new rule permits the inclusion of employees of office or industrial park tenants, each with fewer than 3,000 employees who regularly work at the facility. When we talk about office parks, we really mean office or industrial park. We could mean a strip mall, a specialist shop in an office building, even a financial services building. And Rob, can I ask you to walk through this process because it's a little complicated?
Sure. Yes, it is. Well, but basically, in order to take advantage of this opportunity, the multiple common bond credit union would submit a 4015 easy form to us, either through, again, regular mail, through email, or through fax, but not through the FOMIA system. They would submit a request and then the request would include a letter from an authorized representative of the office or the industrial park, such as a strip mall's leasing agent, an office park's rental agent, whoever. And then they would identify, they would be requesting service for employees for every occupational group in the facility that has fewer than 3,000 people at that facility. So it would be a general request, but we would be interested in the number of potential members based on that. But it would be limited for the occupational groups that just have fewer than 3,000 at the facility. So I guess to walk through an example, let's say the group is a strip mall that has 12 occupational groups, one of which is a large big box retailer. I won't name a specific one, I'll just say that. Let's say each of them at that strip mall's location employ fewer than 3,000 people, but perhaps the big box retailer may have tens of thousands of employees nationwide. The way that would work is a credit union would submit the 4015 EZ along with a letter from the Officer Industrial Parks Authorized Representative requesting the service that would provide information about about the park itself, and then we would the credit union then, after we went through the approval process, would be able to serve the employees of that just work at that facility for each of those groups. So they could serve, for example, let's say that that big box retailer has 300 local employees at that facility. They would be able to serve the 300 employees there, but not the employees nationwide, not the tens of thousands nationwide who do that. So it's kind of a complicated approach, but the goal is to avoid having to, where it makes sense, for a credit union, it gives them a chance to more efficiently enroll smaller companies.
Thank you, Rob. And just to confirm, the employees have to regularly work there. This eligibility would expire when someone ceases regularly working at that facility. But of course, under a once a member, always a member, anyone who joined a credit union under this would always be able to continue their relationship with the credit union if they left that particular park. Rita, anything further on processing?
Just a little bit. I mean, of course, there's no real change in terms of how we would process the inclusion of employees of an office or an industrial park. It would be the same as it would be for a normal or regular occupational group addition, except, of course, we will validate whether or not the group's letter to indicate that all the tenants are within that industrial park are less than 3,000 potential members. And of course, we would want the group, the credit union, to ensure that the group includes that information in their letter when they're applying to serve this type of group.
Okay.
And the sample wording would include employees of tenants of the group, subject to each tenant's employees that form an individual occupational group. Of course, the tenants have to be fewer than 3,000, have fewer than 3,000 employees working at the group, and those employees who work in, of course, whatever city and state at that particular location. I just also want to add here, too, that it's possible that, for example, an associational group or its employees, if you will, if, say, for example, if a labor union was also a tenant, say, of an industrial park or whatever, or then its employees could, in fact, be included in that list of tenants that could be eligible for membership. Of course, not the members. The members would not be eligible, but the employees would be.
Thank you. And also, just to clarify, with this option, if there happens to be a tenant in the park that has greater than 3,000 employees, nothing would preclude them from pursuing membership in a credit union through submitting a request, just like they would before the rule, right?
Yes.
Correct. Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you. All right, let's move on to streamlined documentation requirements for groups 3,000 to 4,999 potential members. Just to give a little bit of background on this, since 2003, we've provided flexibility to federal credit unions seeking to add groups of less than 3,000 potential members by allowing them to use a streamlined application for field of membership form. We call it NCUA 450 EZ. And also to request adding those groups through our field of membership internet application system, something Rob mentioned. The Federal Credit Union Act puts an affirmative duty on NCUA to make a determination that groups greater than 3,000 cannot form their own credit union before allowing them to join a multiple common bond credit union. So this option is meant to reduce or create an additional streamlined documentation for groups with 3,000 to 4,999 members. The preamble to the rule discusses some analysis we did that showed sort of how many members were needed to make a credit union viable. That's what drew us to this conclusion that groups under 5,000 still needed to make a determination that they couldn't form their own credit union under the requirements in the Act, but we didn't need to have as much documentation to make that determination, given it takes much more than that to have a viable credit union. So just to clarify with this, we are still and always will make a determination as required under the Act that a group cannot form its own credit union before adding it. And Rob, can you walk through a little bit about how these requests are made?
Sure. Well, under this new hierarchy, if you will, credit unions would still, for adding groups that have fewer than 3,000 potential members, can still use the 4015 EC. We are presuming the group cannot form its own credit union, and we're presuming any overlap is incidental, so we wouldn't have to require any type of overlap analysis. Now, under this new category, for groups that are between 3,000 potential members and just under 5,000, so 3,000 to 4,999, credit unions can now use the 4015A. So what this does is it provides a more streamlined approach to providing information to allow us to determine whether the group can form its own credit union. So essentially, rather than going through all of the categories discussed in the larger groups, which will remain in place for groups of 5,000 or more, essentially all we're interested in is whether the credit union or whether the group is interested or if they have the resources or desire to form a credit union, rather than having some of the more detailed information that we've requested in the past, such as the dispersion, the geographic dispersion of the members, the demographics of the group, whether, for example, if a group would be just at a certain age where most of the people would be net borrowers, and then that they would not support forming a credit union because there wouldn't be a sufficient deposit base, the ability of a new group to exist in competition, and then the things of that nature. That wouldn't be required in going in detail for that new middle category, and then they could instead use the 4015 as 4015A to have a more streamlined process. And then the more rigorous requirements would be in place for the groups that are 5,000 or more in terms of the potential members. So that's.
Thank you. Rita, anything to add?
Yes. So as Rob, just to reiterate what Rob indicated, with regard to groups that are less than 3,000, no change there. The process remains the same. But for groups between 3,000 and 4,999, we would only look for the credit union or the group to provide a letter just indicating that they have no interest and do not have the resources available to form its own credit union, and that's only the information they would have to indicate in their letter. And of course, we would just validate that that's the case when reviewing the letter. And of course, for groups over 5,000, then they will have to submit the more detailed information that Rob discussed just a minute ago.
Okay. And just to clarify and reiterate, because of our statutory responsibility to make a determination on groups over 3,000, even for this streamlined documentation, they'd have to submit something to it. They can't use FOMIA to do this and seek the automatic approval.
Correct.
That's correct. Okay. Thank you. Moving on to an option near and dear to me, being a military dependent. The final rule extends a multiple combat charter to include honorably discharged veterans of any branch of the United States Armed Forces listed in its charter. This is stemming from a historical recognition of a variety of persons who, by virtue of their relationship to a common bond group, have been entitled to credit union membership eligibility. Principal among these persons are members of the immediate family or household of a primary member of a credit union member, such as a spouse, child, sibling, or grandparent. We believe active duty and honorably discharged military personnel share this kind of affinity based on a close nexus of activities and programs to keep them in a core group. So this option is available for them now. Rob, can you walk through a request on this?
Oh, sure. All a credit union would need to do in this instance is request a housekeeping amendment, and then what we would do from there is update the affinity clause in the credit union's charter. The affinity clause, probably most familiar to most credit union officials out there, will be the clause describing how you could also serve employees of the credit union, members of the immediate family or household, pensioners or annuitants, and that type of group. We would add the honorably discharged veterans or persons honorably discharged from any armed forces group listed in the charter. So as long as a multiple common law nursing, as long as they have just one group in the armed forces, we would be able to add that. So it would provide more service options available, or it would make more service options available for our returning veterans.
Thank you. Rita, anything else?
Nothing really to add to what Rob just said, other than, of course, it's a housekeeping amendment, and of course it is available to single common bond credit unions. I would like to just give the example of what this clause would look like in the affinity section of the field of membership. And as you can see, credit unions are familiar with most of this information that's included in this affinity clause, but we've highlighted the portion where the change will take place, and specifically we put this change strategically in this place so that it was above the members of the immediate family, so that honorable discharge veterans of any branch of the United States Armed Forces that are listed above in the credit union's charter would be eligible for field of membership, as well as its family members would also be eligible for field of membership. I just also want to add, Matt, that this affinity clause does not mean that, or does not suggest that the honorable discharge veterans would sever their relationships with any other institution that they belong to. Of course, the once a member, always a member is still in place, so that this just, again, gives them another option for credit union membership.
Thank you. I think we're in the home stretch here. We got one more item to discuss under a trade, industry, or profession, which is for a single common bond occupational-based credit union. I'm just going to, in the interest of time, I'm just going to let you know that this expands the TIP charter to include employees of entities that have a strong dependency relationship and whose employees work directly with employees of other entities within the same industry. This does define, we got comments in the proposed rule to try and further define what strong dependency is, so there are some examples of it in the final rule preamble. And with that, because this is somewhat of a complicated matter, Rita, I'm going to ask you to walk through how they make a request.
Well, the credit union would simply just submit their well, first of all, they can submit their FOM wording for us to determine whether or not a vendor supplier has a strong dependency relationship with a particular industry. This is a request, of course, that we would work in conjunction with our general counsel's office, who we primarily submit most of these requests to, particularly if it's a new field of membership request. So these are this vendor-supplier relationship, a strong dependency relationship. We will be working with our Office of General Counsel once the credit union submits their request. And, of course, we will review these on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. And, Rob, anything to add further on how we process it?
No, it's just it would require some research on our part and review on our part, and we would consult with our Office of General Counsel to make sure that what they consider or what they propose adding to the definition of the TIP, to make sure that they still fall within that close nexus that we've been requiring. So that's the only thing. It's just it may take some additional time to do that.
Okay. Thank you. All right, so we've gone through extensively what the new rule allows, how a credit union can request a particular element and how we process it. We do have a few minutes left, and I do want to remind you, too, all the questions we've received, we'll get an inventory of all those, and we will look to make sure that we can incorporate as best we can answers or addressing those issues in the guidance we issue. We may also supplement whatever we issue with sort of a Q&A based on the questions in there. But Annette, I'll turn it over to you to ask the first question.
Matt, there appears to be a little confusion with regards to the $2.5 million limit for communities. If that applies to all the community options, even the past ones that have been previously approved that a credit union can request for, or a single political jurisdiction. Well,
let me take a crack at it, and then I'm sure Rob and Rita will will correct me if I say something wrong. So the 2.5 million cap is what we went to. We implemented that when we went to an objective measure to determine a well-defined local community. Single political jurisdictions, that based on just a city or a county, are not subject to a population cap. You can serve the Los Angeles County. There are credit unions serving that. There is no population cap with that. When you go outside of that and want to add have a community based on statistical areas, a core-based statistical area, we showed the slide with the metropolitan statistical areas or the micropolitan statistical areas. Those are subject to a 2.5 million cap. With this new rule adding the combined statistical areas, it is another option. It will provide a lot more avenues of strategic growth for credit unions, but that still right now is subject to a 2.5 million cap also.
And what about the rural district?
The rural district is subject to a 1 million population cap. It went from 250,000 to 1 million with this rule, and that's flat across the board. There is no single political jurisdiction that would allow for that.
Okay, and a quick follow-up question on the population is what population figure is NCUA using? Is it a 2010 census or an estimated, or how do we figure that?
Yeah, we would be using the most recent current estimate that's published by the U.S. Census Bureau. So not for 2010, it would be the most recent estimate, and I think what we have most recently would be the 2015 estimate for population figures based on U.S. Census Data Bureau. It's based on the U.S. Census Bureau data.
And then one other with past previously approved communities that we have available for credit unions to request. Is there a population on that limit?
No, I'm sorry, no, there is not.
Even if it currently exceeds 2.5 million?
Correct. Because the board at some point had determined that area was a local community. So.
Rick, you got one teed up for us?
Yeah, Matt. I've got several on the industrial parks. Who would be an authorized representative to sign to add an industrial park?
Well, most likely it would be the leasing agent or whoever arranges for the tenant to be to have the space available within the industrial park or the office park.
Okay.
So, go ahead.
Oh, okay, sorry. Now, if you have a strip mall and one tenant leaves, another one moves in, do they have to submit another request?
No. The purpose of that is to provide, I guess, some elasticity going forward where they can accommodate the changes to that. There's always going to be comings and goings in these types of facilities. So what the goal is to avoid having to come in with a new request every time there's a change. As long as the change doesn't involve a group coming in that has over 3,000 employees, because then that wouldn't be allowed. They would have to come in separately and request that.
Okay. Do they need to list each business and the number of employees at the site?
I would say we need to have, we could have a total number of employees at the site, but I don't think we would need each business as long as there's an understanding, though, that the credit union can only serve those with fewer than 3,000 employees at the site. We would like the number to work with those total employees. If they have that, they should have that.
And then it's correct to say that only the leasing agent needs to sign the request letter, not each tenant within the strip mall or industrial park, whatever.
Exactly, yes. That was the goal of avoiding having to have each individual employer sign that. Sign the request letter, rather.
Okay.
Annette?
I got a quick one with the population again. If a state has less than 2.5 million, could a credit union look at serving the entire state?
So I think the last we left off, the board had established a policy of not allowing a whole state. We had proposed it with this rule with the congressional district. with a population limit now of 1 million for a rural district, we are approaching the point where that could be a likelihood that could come up now. I think Montana is just under 1 million or maybe just over. So
it's a little under.
Yeah, so I think it's just over.
So that's good.
Yeah, so that
Right.
So those
in fact those would be allowed for that. So yeah, if Montana's population ever dipped down below the 1 million, then theoretically they would be able to serve the entire state.
To clarify, there are a few states like South Dakota, North Dakota that are below the 1 million who could possibly fall within that.
Yeah, right. And if the rural district met the requirements of the density test and the other things to be a rural district, then that would be something we would consider.
Okay. Switching charter types, multiple common bond. Is the 4015A the new form that's to be used for the 3,000 to 4,999? Is that published somewhere?
Yes, it's available in the new rule. It's when this rule goes live, it'll of course be on our internet site on the landing page, describing that. But it's part of the rule itself. It's part of the rule that was published in the Federal Register. So the new form is included with that. So that would be available.
Okay, and then there's the reduced documentation that's required with regards to the forming of a credit union for that group size.
Yes.
Is that information needing to come from the group, or can a credit union merely state that on behalf of the group?
Ideally, it would come from the group.
So the group's letter should contain it?
Yes.
Yeah, signed by the group, yeah.
Yes, ideally that would come. I mean, sometimes, in very rare cases, if it's not available or for whatever reason they won't provide it, it would somehow have to be corroborated with independent research. That we need something on that.
And then just to add to that too, Annette, one of the things we're planning to issue to help readability with this charting manual is a PDF version of the manual that'll be on our website under the FOM resources. That'll have a electronic or a hyperlinked table of contents. It'll also have footers at the bottom of each page that'll show you what section, what chapter you're in, to make it a little bit more easier to read and understand. And those forms will be in that version of it also.
Thank you.
Thanks. And
Rick?
Okay, just a clarification on the retired service people. The credit union just wants clarification. So if they were originally chartered to serve the Air Force, then they would now be able to serve anybody who is retired from the Air Force.
yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, it would include anybody. It wouldn't just be that particular base or whatever. It would be anybody, as long as they still have the group in their charter, it would be anybody retired from that branch of the service. So
Because now, just so I'm clear too, I was under the impression that option, the retired individuals, was an option, the affinity option that was earlier available to some groups, that this was for honorably discharged who may not have retired. They weren't retired, they just had served and left. Isn't there a distinction between those two, between a retired person and that affinity clause?
well, a retired would be covered under the pensioners and annuitants
Right.
in the affinity clause.
All right, so if we hadn't done this, likely would that same individual working for the Air Force who retired still be eligible for membership as a retired annuitant?
Not if they didn't retire from that particular Air Force or that particular base.
Okay.
Under the current.
I'm not right, but I'm not wrong.
Well, no, it's a.
And then, since I'm showing my ignorance of some of this stuff, there's a question up there I want to see. It relates to the strip mall and I think it's touching on the reasonable proximity. The strip mall does include a credit union location. Can one of you hit on that? How that relates to the reasonable proximity?
Yeah.
Well, I think the actual full question, does the strip mall, must there be a credit union in the strip mall itself?
No, the credit union does not have to be in the strip mall, but of course, where the strip mall is headquartered, it has to be within reasonable proximity to where the credit union is located. So if that's where all the tenants are located, then it has to be within a reasonable distance to the credit union's location.
Okay.
Annette?
My question deals with the underserved area, and there's a little confusion with regards to the CFPB, designated underserved areas. Is that able to replace the concentration of facilities ratio test that's performed by NCUA as one of the 5 tests that's required to be met for an underserved area?
Yes.
Okay, so if it meets the CFPB designated underserved county,
Yes.
the facilities test would not need to be completed.
Right.
Correct.
The facilities test is a mechanism to conclude that the area is underserved by other institutions, and so there is flexibility in the act in how we draw that conclusion. What we have to rely on data from us or the federal banking agencies, but the analysis we do can be different. It doesn't have to be the concentration of facilities test.
Okay, but we're not doing away with the concentration of
No. For most cases, that will be how they qualify on that. But this just provides an additional opportunity on that. See, in the case of the CFPB, another agency has done some rigorous testing to draw that conclusion, so they would be able to. So we want to be able to leverage off of those efforts and streamline where we can the requirements.
Right, and that provides somewhat of an objective standard, which is helpful.
Sure.
Thank you.
Rick?
Okay. The credit union wants to know if they were already in the midst of completing an underserved application. Do they have to resubmit the area to see if it matches CFPB's underserved county?
No. That's definitive.
Yes, it is.
Annette?
There's some processing times. On average, what does NCUA try to work towards with regards to processing a community package that is deemed complete at the point? If it's not deemed complete, what's kind of the processing times?
Well, again, our goal is to have complete packages processed within a 60-day time frame. I mean, things can always vary. I mean, if we get a large influx, sometimes it may take longer depending on the workload in the office. But we try to get through them as quickly as we can, and help get people access as quickly as possible. So it can vary on that. I mean, a lot depends on the area requested, in terms of that, or the detail that's provided in the business plan, and how supportable and how consistent everything is with the credit union's resources and administrative ability to serve a larger area. So there's our goal overall is 60 days for the more complicated ones on that, but it can vary based on those types of variables.
And then, Rita, you talked a little bit about the business plan, NCUA's letter of 2011. Can you elaborate a little on that in how a credit union, what we look at with regards to a credit union supporting that they can serve it? Is there a number of branches? Got to be part of the co-op network system? Do you even have to have a branch?
Well, of course, the letter to credit unions also includes the actual template that a credit union would need to follow or use as its resource in developing its business and marketing plan. And that template kind of pretty much outlines the specific information we would be looking for credit unions to include, in its or to address in its business and marketing plan. And just to give some examples, we would be looking at primarily, first of all, the reason why the credit union wants to expand or convert to the to a community charter. We also will be looking at the products and services that they have to, of course, that kind of leans to their ability to serve the community that they're requesting. Other areas would include growth projections, what they plan to, how they plan to grow with regard to members, shares, and loans. Again, just demonstrating the ability and, of course, the intent to serve the area. We would be looking to see this template would include a marketing plan, or suggested the credit union would submit a marketing plan, again, detailing how they plan to reach out to the residents in the community, and again, just to demonstrate its ability and intent to serve the community.
So if they go to expand, and let's say it's into another county, you would not necessarily have to put another branch if maybe those residents in that a county that you're trying to include now were commuting in or kind of part of the trade area, the hub, economic hub.
Correct. Yeah, a new branch or infrastructure may not be needed. Of course, we would want to see that that facility that the credit union has in place is accessible to the majority of the residents in the community, and they of course intend to serve those residents via that branch.
I think we got time for one more question. Rick?
Okay, this one is the credit union wants to know, can a community charter serve a CBSA, an adjacent area, assuming there is appropriate interaction between the communities, and an area designated as rural?
That would be mixing charter types and different communities, especially the last part, adding the rural would cause a problem. The first two aspects would be fine. Right, Matt?
Yeah, the final product needs to be a well-defined area. And it would be very unlikely that an area within a CBSA could also meet the requirements for being a rural district. So it would, although I guess it may be theoretically, but it would be unlikely from a practical standpoint that it could qualify that way.
But Rob, I think you had like an example where you have the CBSA or the CSA, and the adjacent area is kind of a rural county that they're trying to pick up, and the adjacent.
Well, yes, that would be possible. It wouldn't qualify as a rural district, though. It would qualify as a well-defined local community. Let me elaborate a little bit more, because I did mean to do that when we were covering. I'll give a shout out to my former Region 1. And in the Albany area, for example, there's an Albany Metropolitan Statistical Area, which is the 4 counties around Albany. But just south of it, there's a couple of counties that don't have any affiliation with a core-based statistical area. And it may be possible that the evidence could show that the people in those counties, I believe it was Columbia County or Greene County were the two that spring to mind. One of those counties could possibly have sufficient ties to the Albany Metropolitan Statistical Area where it shows there's interdependence on the two areas. Again, I'm not, please don't take this to mean that I've ruled that that is the case, but I just want to say as an example of how that would be something that you would wish to examine if it made sense, to see if those areas do have sufficient ties on that. So that would be an example of what it would, perhaps those counties isolated by themselves would qualify as rural district, but the way they would qualify is it would be based on the interaction or common interest with the larger core-based statistical area. Thanks.
Thank you. Franz, can you go to the last slide, please? So this does, we've reached our allotted time here. We do need to sign off. I wanted to just leave you here with the contact information for Rob and Rita, their divisions and their staff. We're going to be working on finalizing the guidance. We're going to look at all the questions that have been submitted, incorporate what we can into the guidance, and certainly as you are going through implementing some of the elements of this new rule, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. I think both Rob and Rita would welcome questions in advance of even starting to think about a strategy as you're starting to put pen to paper on what you want to do. They can certainly help out with that. So with that, I'll thank you for your time and look for the archive of this to come out in a couple of weeks. Thank you.